Hello, welcome. Hope you are doing well. In this video, we're going to talk about why zone 2 cardio is not necessarily a waste of your time, perhaps, but it's really just not a topic that is worth too much of your attention. Or at the very least, for the vast majority of people who are interested in this sort of thing, it's just not going to make the difference that you might think it's going to make. So as usual, here's the plan and the talking points for the video. We'll first talk about what is zone 2, because obviously that's quite important to be on the same page of what we're talking about. And I do think that most people have a bit of a superficial understanding of what it actually is or what it's meant to be. We'll talk about when you should do zone 2 and who it is most appropriate for. And then more importantly, who it does not really matter for. And again, the overarching theme and claim that I hope to make with this video is that most people are going to fit in this camp of it not really mattering for you. And then finally, we'll, if you are in this camp of zone 2 not really being too important for your goals, we'll then talk about what to do instead and what is going to be more productive for you. And then, as always, there are a number of references and citations I'm going to refer to as I speak to the topics in this video, which I will cite the links to them down below in the description box. So let me just start off by saying that this zone 2 right here is not the zone 2 that I am referring to in this video, and it's probably not the zone 2 that you've heard about on social media and things of the sort. I do get that makes things a bit more confusing, but I assure you that there is a reason that I put this here. So when people talk about heart rate zones or intensity zones in endurance training, there's really two main different classifications of them that people are referring to. There's the 3-zone model, which to me is the correct one, and then there is the 5-zone model, which is the one that is most commonly talked about on things like social media. And now the reason the 3-zone model is here, because again, we're talking about the zone 2 and the 5-zone model. I want to be very clear about my delineation here, but the 5-zone model is really meant to be a sort of expansion of the 3-zone model here. So understanding this, at least very briefly, is going to make the zone 2 you see elsewhere a bit more real. So as you perform some type of exercise, and it could be cycling, it could be running, or something like that, as your intensity increases, your body produces more of this compound called lactate. Along with this lactate comes an increase in acid within the muscle, and this speaks to and contributes to the fatigue you feel during exercise, and how long you can hold any given intensity. So this buildup of lactate and acid is part of the reason why at higher intensities you cannot sustain them for quite as long as lower intensities. So as lactate is increasing within the blood, there's two main points that the rate at which it increases itself increases. So that's 2 millimoles of lactate per liter of blood and 4 millimoles of lactate per liter of blood. And a millimole is just the unit of measurement for lactate, and liter is liter of blood. So this graph, this is one I made just to illustrate it. It's a little misleading because you never really at zero, I guess it doesn't really say that, but you never really quite this low. But as you begin the onset of exercise, lactate is going to increase while you're in the zone 1. Once you hit 2 millimoles of lactate per liter of blood, it's going to increase at a faster rate here. And once you pass 4, it's going to increase even faster. And usually once you get into this point, you're tapping out from whatever you're doing in about 2 to 4-ish minutes or so. So the 3-zone model is created to sort of demarcate these 3 distinct rates of increase of lactate within the blood. And now the only real way to formally test lactate is to do a quick blood draw, like on your finger, the same way you would do like a glucose sort of draw. You test it and you see where it's at. That's not really practical if you're going on a run in the woods or something like that. So usually people use heart rate to sort of estimate what zone they're in, if they're in zone 1, zone 2, or zone 3. Or even more practically and arguably just as effective, these 3 zones tend to correspond very well with what you would consider easy for zone 1, moderate intensity for zone 2, and hard to very hard for zone 3. Now, like I said, the 5-zone model, which is the one you would see across social media, like people like Peter Attia, which feels weird to sort of mention him in this video because he was very proliferous in the Epstein files. That's obviously a different discussion, but he's sort of the guy that, in my opinion, on social media popularized the idea of zone 2 cardio, at least in social media, so to speak. And zone 2, or the 5-zone model, what it seeks to do is split zone 1 of the 3-zone model in half. So zone 1 of the 5-zone model will be the bottom half of zone 1, and zone 2 of the 5-zone model will be the top half of zone 1 right here. So you're essentially getting right below this lactate threshold 1, and then you're staying there, you're not crossing it for whatever period of time you're engaging in the exercise. And then same thing, so for zone 3 and zone 4 of the 5-zone model, that's going to split zone 2 in half right here, and then zone 3 would correspond to just straight up zone 5 in the 5-zone model. Now, the benefit of doing any sort of exercise in zone 1, if you're using the 3-zone model, or in zone 1, zone 2, if you're using the 5-zone model. So if you're below this green line, this lactate threshold 1 right here, is that the volume you accumulate at this intensity is going to meaningfully drive adaptation, but it's going to have a very low demand in terms of recovery. So the benefit is that it allows you to accumulate very high volumes of exercise without feeling beat up or being inhibited elsewhere in your life or things like that. And something else worth noting about, let's say, zone 2 training using the 5-zone model or a zone 1 down here is that there's a number of review papers that have looked at the training patterns of people who did the best in things like the New York City Marathon, the Boston Marathon, and people who scored a bit more middle of the pack or lower in terms of like, high level running and things like that. And the people who did the best in those sort of events spent a much higher percent of their time in these lower intensities down here, as opposed to spending more time in this like middle to higher intensity type of training. Moreover, there are some people out there who will put out the idea that there's certain, let's say, molecular machinery, certain means through which you're producing energy that are occurring when you're below this lactate threshold 1 that are sort of turned off or not quite as active when you're above the lactate threshold 1. And spending more time activating those to their highest extent is beneficial. However, that itself is very mechanistic, hypothetical, wishful thinking, not wishful thinking, I shouldn't say that, but educated guess type of thinking just in general. Recently, there was a review paper that looked at, is there really anything special or specific about zone 2 training? And the bottom line of all this stuff is that all of the adaptations are driven by the volume of exercise that you complete, not necessarily the intensity. It's just the intensity, the zone 2 training, this, training below this lactate threshold 1 right here, that allows you to complete the volumes needed to hit certain goals without getting injured or feeling like you got hit by a truck every single day. So that leads into the idea of, who should be doing zone 2 cardio. And or at least I should say, for whom is zone 2 cardio a required training practice? And I would say it's people who are pursuing a goal that requires super high volumes of training. Now, an hour a day of endurance training as might be a fair enough definition for what I mean by super high volumes of training. But for people who are really psychopathic about this sort of stuff, I'm not saying that as a bad thing per se, but 8 to 12 hours per week of endurance training specifically, that's not counting even strength training or other forms of structured training that might be doing. That is sort of what I'm referring to here. So things like training for an Ironman triathlon or a marathon would constitute that as well, even though a marathon is just 1/3 of the Ironman race. Or something like, say you're doing like a multiple super long hike in Yosemite or something like that. All of those sort of things would require high volumes of exercise to prepare sufficiently, and thus zone 2 would be reasonable to do to justify or to do those super high volumes of training safely and not get injured along the way. So if you are not undergoing very high volumes of endurance training, there's really no reason that zone 2 is a requirement for you. Now, you can do your training at zone 2 and you will see progress doing that. You just, one, might take a bit longer to finish any given training session if it's done at a lower intensity, because if it's done at a lower intensity, it's, by definition going to take you a bit longer to do. And theoretically, you might not even see as good of results as if you pushed it to a higher intensity, provided you can recover from it, which if you're not doing super high intensities, you probably can. So, as I say here, let's say you're doing structured endurance training or conditioning or something of the sort 3 times per week for an hour or less per session. You could do absolutely none of that at zone 2, again, using the 5-zone model, and probably recover just fine. Now, again, how well you recover from exercise is itself something that you adapt to over time as you engage in this sort of activity, or really any activity. So there can be some dependency on how fit you are baseline. But again, even if you are completely untrained with endurance or conditioning or anything of the sort, very quickly early on, you will reach a point where you can do this sort of training structure, none of which at zone 2, and recover just fine the next day. So to put an example to this, let's say you are someone who is running, let's say 3 to 5 miles, 2 to 3 times per week. If you ran all of those miles in, let's say, again, stay with the 5-zone model here, using like zone 3, zone 4, like you're pushing the heart rate a little bit up, you would finish those miles in a more time efficient manner and probably see better results, because again, with volume matched, higher intensity tends to drive better results than lower intensity. However, now again, zone 2, throwing all of that volume at zone 2 will give you results, and it is a little bit easier. So if you don't necessarily have the mental drive to push to that extent, or whatever extent would come to mind to you, that's also totally okay. If you're consistent with that over time, you will see results. So that's why I preface this video by saying it's not necessarily a waste of time, because it's still worth doing, but it's not a requirement per se, at least not to the extent that most people on social media will push it to be. And so, like I said, a lot of this depends on what the best structure of conditioning or endurance training looks like for you at this point in time. And ideally, there's more than just this steady state-ish type of training that we're talking about here. But based off this information, there's really 2 things you can do. You can, one, continue to perform your sessions at zone 2, the second option, if you were doing that previously, because again, it's not wrong. It's just going to take you a little bit less time, and it might drive a slightly less results than higher intensities, or you can push each individual training session to the highest intensity that you can reasonably recover from it. Now, I want to be very clear. This is not saying you train as hard as you can, that every session is max effort. This might just mean letting your heart rate hang around 150 instead of, rigidly keeping it at 120 to 125 or whatever, your predicted zone 2 is. And then with that said, that's all that I have for this video here today. Hopefully that helps. And if you have any questions, comments, concerns about anything I said, don't hesitate to let me know. Again, like I said, the references that I was speaking about before, I will link down in the description box below. Hope you're doing well. Hope you have a good rest of your day, and I will speak to you soon.